In this video, I'm going to take you through the AO3 for family dysfunction. Now, remember, you don't need to know all three types of family dysfunction. You don't need to know schizophrenic mother, double bind, and expressed emotion, but it would be good for you to have two of the three, which means just sort of pick and mix whichever AO3 points are relevant to the two explanations you've chosen to learn in lots of detail. So we're going to be looking at evidence for family dysfunction. We'll be looking for evidence for double bind and evidence for expressed emotion. You'll notice that I don't have any evidence for schizophrenic mother, and this is because almost no solid research actually exists. This theory was based on clinical observations of patients and informal assessments of the personalities of the mothers of patients, but there's actually no really systematic scientific evidence for this, and so I can't find any to include. Instead, we'll be looking at the limitations of schizophrenic mother. So I'm going to take you through the evidence for family dysfunction, double bind, and expressed emotion. In future lessons, we're going to be looking at family therapy. And so I don't have a slide on it in here, but once you've learned about family therapy, you'll know how it applies and how it can be used to support these explanations. We're going to be talking about the over-reliance on retrospective data and also the socially sensitive nature of these explanations. And likewise, you can refer back to your biological explanations, for example, genetic or neural, and provide a comparison. So write a really nice comparison paragraph with evidence to show that biological explanations might be stronger. And we'll also be talking about the interactionist explanation, looking at research by Tirinari. This is the very last dot point on the specification for schizophrenia, and so you'll have much more detail to add to this point later on, but for now we're just going to touch on how an interactionist approach might be best when trying to explain schizophrenia. So, let's start off with evidence for family dysfunction more generally. This isn't focused on one of the three specific types of family dysfunction, but it is providing support that of the psychodynamic explanations, that early childhood experiences do put somebody at increased risk for developing schizophrenia. So research suggests that dysfunctional child relationships are linked with increased risk of the disorder. In Reed's research, they found that 69% of adult women with schizophrenia had a history of abuse, either physical or sexual, in childhood, and this was also significant in men as well. When we compare that to the general population, obviously this is overwhelmingly suggesting that early childhood abuse increases one's risk for schizophrenia. We can also look at attachment style, and this research by Berry found that insecure attachments to primary caregivers also make somebody more likely to have schizophrenia. So it seems like having a secure attachment with a caregiver provides a bit of a protective factor, while insecure attachments increase risk. Most people with schizophrenia report at least one significant childhood trauma, not necessarily due to abuse, but at least one significant childhood trauma. So the evidence suggests that family dysfunction may be a valid explanation for schizophrenia. In terms of specific family dysfunctions now, we're going to look at the double bind theory. So these are those contradictory statements where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, that creates control by confusion. And this research by Berger found that schizophrenics reported their mothers giving significantly greater number of commands, comments, and admonitions than healthy controls, i.e., the mothers of schizophrenics were controlling, they were critical, they were giving commands and comments, and this suggests that there perhaps is a link between double bind communication and the development of schizophrenia. And so here we've got direct evidence here. Now, I know it doesn't look like these are examples of double binds, but it does tie into the fact that particular communication styles in families can lead to schizophrenia. And then finally, we have evidence for expressed emotion. And here, a meta-analysis providing more evidence that expressed emotion has high predictive validity, particularly when it comes to relapse of schizophrenia. So this was a meta-analysis, 30 studies, 1,500 patients, and they found that EE is a significant and robust predictor of relapse in schizophrenia. So families where there is high EE, the relapse rate was 50%, low EE, the relapse rate is 21%. So overwhelmingly, we can see that patients who are returning to a family that show expressed emotion are more likely to relapse than patients who return to a family with low expressed emotion, suggesting that EE has high predictive validity when it comes to relapse. However, there are some criticisms with all of these family dysfunction explanations. They all rely on retrospective data. They all rely on the schizophrenic patient looking back and reporting on their childhood, reporting on the behaviour and actions of their mother, reporting on the communication style which was found in their family. This information about childhood is gathered after the symptoms develop, and I want you to think carefully about how reliable that data is. Remember that we've spoken about cognitive distortions, which includes memory issues. And so we need to really question how reliable that data is. The patient may have distorted recall of their childhood. We know that having to recall memories from childhood is unreliable just due to normal issues with memory in healthy patients. And here we're talking about people who, through their disorder, suffer from even greater cognitive distortions and impacts on their memory. We would need to conduct prospective, so looking at the child, determining which families are high EE, determining the traits of double-bind communication, for example, and then follow these children through to adulthood to see who develops schizophrenia. So we would need to conduct prospective longitudinal research. And this has found some support, but actually the findings have been fairly inconsistent. And so we definitely can't draw any conclusions from prospective longitudinal research. The data just isn't there. I think the biggest criticism of all of these family dysfunction explanations are that they are socially sensitive. They are essentially parent blaming, and in most cases, they are blaming the mother. This reflects the deeply misogynistic theories that came out in the 1950s and 1960s. And we just need to really be careful here. Here we're dealing with families and parents who are seeing their child go through really terrible symptoms, and they're having to perhaps give up their job to care for somebody with schizophrenia. And then, on top of that, they're being traumatized by being blamed for causing the disorder. That's really troubling. Really, really troubling. There's potentially some causation issues here as well. Could it be that having a family member with schizophrenia actually increases the tension and hostility in the family? Who's to say that that tension and hostility existed before the disorder and therefore caused the disorder? So could having a patient with schizophrenia lead to hostility and tension? That's probably a stronger explanation. We also have to consider that biological explanations might be stronger, so refer back to your genetic and neural explanations. And in later lessons, we'll look at family therapy and evidence that family therapy, which focuses on changing the communication styles of family members of the patient with schizophrenia, can actually be really, really effective. So in terms of this socially sensitive nature of the research and the parent blaming, I just want you to have a read of this quote. And I think this is a really fair criticism of a lot of those misogynistic theories about schizophrenia that were around in the 1950s. Here we are just blaming the mother for everything. And then finally, again, you're going to have more that you can add and elaborate later on once we cover interactionist explanations for schizophrenia. And we've already encountered Tianari's research when we looked at biological explanations, the genetic explanations. So here in this research, they followed children who were born of mothers that had schizophrenia, and then these children had been adopted away. And the incidence of schizophrenia is actually quite illuminating. So these are, remember, all children who had a genetic risk of developing schizophrenia. The actual rates of schizophrenia differed depending on whether those children with the genetic vulnerability were adopted into healthy families or dysfunctional families. So the children who had a risk of schizophrenia who were adopted by healthy families, 5.8 of those children developed schizophrenia. When we look at the children who had a genetic risk who were raised in dysfunctional families, that is much, much higher. 36.8% of those children went on to develop the disorder. So this is interesting in two ways. First, it supports the family dysfunction theory. It says that living in a dysfunctional family increases your risk of developing schizophrenia. But it also suggests that there is a genetic element as well. Individuals with high genetic vulnerability are at increased risk of developing schizophrenia, even if they're adopted into healthy families. But that risk increases even further if they've been adopted into dysfunctional families. So we'll talk more about that later at the end of this topic.